Sorry guys, I don't know what happened. I messed up Panoptos or stopped in the middle of this lecture. So we're just going to pick up where we left off with part 2. So just continuing. So a second ago, we talked about supply versus quantity supplied. Well, now we need to look at a change in supply versus a change in quantity supplied. So change in supply versus change in quantity supplied. So a change in supply says that across all prices, remember, because supply looks at a range of prices, so across all prices, quantity supplied is higher or could be lower than before. So across all prices, quantity supplied is higher or lower than before. So let's take a look. Draw yourself a graph, P and Q. And now we're going to start with our supply curve S0. But for whatever reason, and we haven't talked about the reasons yet, at all prices, at $2, at $3, at $4, at $5, at $6, quantity supplied by suppliers is higher than it was before. So, at all prices, firms are willing to put more on the market for sale. So if I connect all these, I get a new supply curve S1. So what we've just illustrated is an increase in supply. And clearly, we draw an increase in supply as a shift to the right. Now remember, guys, let's just make a little note that a demand increase is also a shift to the right. So supply and demand shift in the same direction. Well, now, what if instead we moved in the other direction? So let's start with supply curve S0. But in this case, suppliers across all prices want to put less on the market than before. So at $5, at $4, at $3, at $2, all of those prices, they want to decrease quantity supplied. So now we have a new supply curve, S1. So what we've just illustrated is a decrease in supply. And we draw a decrease in supply as a shift to the left. But remember, guys, same note that a demand decrease is also a shift to the left. So it doesn't matter which one we're talking about, supply or demand, it's a shift to the left or right. And please make a note that it's left or right only. Do not think up or down, because look at the first graph. Look at this one right here. It kind of looks like it's decreasing, right? Because it's moving downward. But that's not the way we want to think about it, left or right. Now, we need to ask the question, what causes this? What would cause supply to shift left or right? Well, ask yourself, what caused demand to shift left or right? And the answer is a change in one of the ceteris paribus assumptions. And that's why we call those ceteris paribus assumptions for supply, we call them supply shifters. So, change in supply. The entire curve is shifting left or right. Let's contrast that with a change in quantity supplied. change in quantity supplied means that, for example, if price equals 20 and your quantity supplied is 100 units, so that's where you were, now you're moving away from that. So let's illustrate this. So again, P and Q are our axes. Let's put supply curve S0. And now let's label our price of 20. And we know at a price of 20, we're at point A on the supply curve, and quantity supplied is 100, right? So this right here is our quantity supplied, right? So now we're saying, for some reason, quantity supplied switches, instead of 100, maybe instead we want to only put, let's say, 60 on the market. So this is my new quantity supplied. Well, that would put us on point B. But what caused that? What caused us to go from wanting to put 100 units on the market to 60 units on the market? Well, hopefully you see it's because we're being offered a lower price. Instead of $20, maybe now we're being offered $15. So do you notice here, look on the left, the entire curve shifts. When we're talking about a change in supply, the entire curve shifts. But when we're talking about a change in quantity supplied, we're talking about simply movement along a given demand, rather, supply curve. So we need to ask the question, what would cause this? So what causes quantity supply to change? Oops, sorry. What causes quantity supply to change? Well, what caused this right here? Wasn't it caused by this? So it's caused by a change in price. So let's revisit that. What are we saying here? What causes supply to change? A change in ceteris paribus assumptions. What causes quantity supplied to change? Well, a change in price. So this is something you need to understand very, very well. And again, it's just a mechanic. We haven't done anything with it. You just have to kind of intuitively get it, and you have to understand the graphs. So now let's move on to talk more about this idea. What causes supply to shift? Ceteris paribus assumptions. So let's go on to talk about the ceteris paribus assumptions for supply. So we're going to call these, oh, that's not what I want, pen, sorry. We want to talk about the supply shifters. In other words, what are the CPAs for supply? So the first one is easy. We have technology. And specifically, we have a technological advance. Because, right, no one has a technological retreat voluntarily. So if we have a technological advance, then what that says is that we can get more out of our resources than we could before. So we can get more out of resources than before. That's what technology does for us. It allows us to get more out of that same amount of resources. So if we can get more out of our resources than before, then what we have here is a supply increase. So it's very simple. Technological advance creates supply increases. So again, how would I draw that? If we're starting at S0, a shift to the right, supply increase. Number 2, also a pretty easy one, price of inputs. Price of inputs. Price of inputs, well, inputs are our factors of production. So inputs are those things that we use to produce, our factors of production. So it could be things like labor, it could be raw materials, it could be capital. Price of inputs. So think about it. If you're a firm and the price of inputs goes up, is that good for you or bad for you? Well, hopefully it's pretty obvious to you that if the cost of your labor goes up and the cost of your raw materials goes up, that's going to be bad for you as a producer. So obviously this is going to have a negative effect on your supply. So supply goes down. But what if instead the price of inputs goes down? So for whatever reason, labor's cheaper for you or raw materials are cheaper for you. Do you agree that if we're thinking from the perspective as being a producer, we would say that that's good for you as a producer? So if that's good for you as a producer, then obviously supply is going to go up. So technological advance, number 1, that's pretty easy. Number 2, price of inputs, also pretty easy. Three, we're going to call price of other things you could produce instead. The price of other things you could produce instead. Or another way of thinking about it is your opportunity cost. So the price of other things you could produce instead, those things you're not producing but you could do. So it's the things you're giving up, your opportunity cost. So this is best if I illustrate by example. So let's say you're a farmer and you're growing soybean. But you notice that alfalfa is fetching really good prices. So maybe price of alfalfa has been on the rise. Well, if you're growing soybean, then do you agree alfalfa is your opportunity cost, right? It's the thing you could produce, but you're not producing, so it's what you're giving up. So what happens as the price of alfalfa gets higher? Do you agree that maybe your opportunity cost is getting bigger? Right? You're giving up more and more money from the alfalfa you could be growing, but you're not. So how might this affect your decisions? You're growing soybean, but alfalfa is fetching higher and higher prices. So is it possible that you're going to change your mind about what you're doing? It might be the case that you decide to decrease your supply of soybean so that you can free up some land and increase the supply of alfalfa, right? So that's what we mean by the price of other things you could produce instead. If alfalfa is getting a really low price, then you don't have that big of an opportunity cost, and you might stick with what you're doing. But at some point, if the price of alfalfa gets high enough, you might change your mind. And so you decrease soybean so you can increase alfalfa. So price of other things you could produce instead. Number 4. Number 4 is just like one we saw with demand. Expectations of future prices. Expectations of future prices. But whose expectations? So we have to remember, we're talking about suppliers' expectations of future prices. So this was a demand shifter, but remember, it was expectations of future prices on the part of consumers. So consumers' expectations. But now we have to think about from the perspective of a supplier. So let's assume that you expect prices of what you're selling to decrease in the future. So you're selling something, let's call it good X, and the price of good X is going to fall in the future. That's what you think. Well, are you just going to sit there and go, oh gosh, that's a bummer? Or are you going to try to change your behavior? Well, if you think prices are going to fall, when do you want to sell your good? Do you want to sell it now, or do you want to sell it later? Well, hopefully you understand that you want to sell it now. So you're going to put more on the market now, and that means less on the market later in the future. If instead you expect price to increase in the future, now think about how you're going to behave. You've got some good, and you can sell it now or you can sell it later. And here, in this example, prices are going up. So do you want to sell it now, or do you want to wait till the price goes up? Well, you want to wait till the price goes up, right? So you would decrease supply now so that you could increase your supply later. So again, your expectations of changing prices are going to affect your behavior. Now, the kind of good that you're selling might matter here. If you've got fresh fish, right? Can you decrease your supply of fresh fish now and sell it later? And I'm talking about you sell it fresh, so you're not putting it in a freezer. Well, your fish is going to go bad, right? So that's not going to work. But what if instead your good is oil? I'm drawing little droplets of oil. If your good is oil, can you decrease your supply now, leave it in inventory, and put it on the market later when the price goes up? Sure, you can. And people do this all the time. This is an idea called arbitrage. So if I'm sitting on a commodity like oil and I think price of oil is going to go up, I might just hang on to that oil until the price rises. Last one, number 5. Number 5 is an easy one as well, because it's also like one you saw with demand. So you had number of demanders. This is number of suppliers. So how many firms or people are out there supplying this? Very simple. If number of suppliers goes up, more people are out there supplying, then doesn't it make sense that supply goes up? And if number of suppliers goes down, then supply goes down. It's really simple, right? Think about apartments in Farmville, Virginia. If there are more firms coming in and building apartments, supply of apartments goes up. If somebody decides to tear down an apartment building because they were offered a lot of money and somebody wants to turn it into something else, well, supply goes down. So guys, it's going to be incredibly important that you get these shifters memorized. So let's put them side by side and you'll see that you have a little less to memorize than what you thought. So demand shifters and supply shifters. So remember, number one for demand, preferences. Number two, income. And you had to deal with if it's normal or if it's inferior. The third, price of related goods. And you had to think about whether they were complements or substitutes. Number four was expectations of future prices. But remember, we were talking about consumers, their expectations. And then number five, number of demanders. If we look on the supply side, number one was technology. Number two, price of inputs. Number three, price of other things. You could produce instead. So 1, 2, and 3 are a little different, but number 4, we're back to expectations of future prices. But whose expectations are we talking about? Suppliers. And then finally, number 5, number of suppliers. So hopefully you see that 4 and 5 are basically the same. But there's one more important thing that we need to note. There are these things that I'm going to call other supply shifters. They're not ceteris paribus assumptions, but they are things that can shift supply. One example might be weather. Maybe we're talking about a crop. So maybe we're talking about supply of corn, and it's been adversely affected by weather. Another one could be civil unrest. So an example here might be war in the Middle East. And war in the Middle East, we know, has disrupted oil production. But then we have trade barriers. Trade barriers, remember, affect the supply of foreign products, right? So we talked about quotas and tariffs. So those can also shift supply. So be looking for things that are ceteris paribus assumptions, but don't forget, for supply, there could be other things like weather, civil unrest, and trade barriers that aren't ceteris paribus assumptions, but they can also shift supply. So it's important, guys, that you know this chart like the back of your hand. We're going to be moving on to talk about story problems in a sense, where I give you a scenario and you're going to have to decide, are there demand shocks? Are there supply shocks? You're going to have to be able to put it together on a graph and figure out what's going to happen in the market. And we'll clearly work on this together. But for right now, your task is to get these demand and supply ceteris paribus assumptions memorized. Let me know if you have any questions, and have a fantastic day.